And these are the rules that I lay down for every single client that I bring on board here. But the first rule, number one, is to tell a compelling story. And this gets back to this drum that you're going to hear me bang again and again and again. Do not just describe your products and services. If you're doing that, it's an infomercial, and those are terrible. Instead, you want to provide some sort of value to your listeners. And so this is a branded podcast that I actually listen to myself. REI, the outdoors equipment company, they have a great podcast, and it's not about the tents and boots and backpacks that they sell. It's about people going out into nature and hiking up mountains and fighting grizzly bears and whitewater rafting and all that kind of stuff, the great stories that happen in the outdoors. And mind you, while they're out there, they're using tents and backpacks and boots, and they got them at REI, but that's not the point of the podcast. The podcast is about telling these really compelling stories of people going out and doing things, and that's interesting to me because I identify with that. I like to think of myself as a rugged outdoorsman too. My wife might dispute that a little bit, but I like to think I could fight a grizzly bear, and so listening to this podcast for me is a great way to hear stories about other people doing that. Rule number two, and this is kind of hand in hand with rule number one there, is to do something original. As I mentioned earlier, there are 1 million active podcasts out there right now. So if you're a realtor and you want to do a realty podcast where you go out and talk about market conditions and what it means, you should be advised that there are several thousand other podcasts out there that do that already. And if you're retreading old ground, you're essentially going up against and competing against these people that have been doing it longer than you have and have already built up a base of listeners. And so you want to tack an original course for what you're going to do. Find what sets your brand apart and celebrate that. Rule number three, and this might be the most important among them, I should probably move it to rule number one, but you need to define your niche before you even produce your first episode. You want to know who your listener is. Determine who that target listener is and then speak to them in a language that nobody else speaks to them to, and you will develop a rabid following. Mass appeal is not the objective with a podcast. You want to have that niche appeal. And so the example that I have here is an entire subgenre of podcasts that makes no sense to me personally. Woodworking podcasts are insanely popular. I have a buddy who's a woodworker, and he just spends all afternoon in his shop working on whatever project he has going on and listening to these podcasts. And he does that because these are the only people who get him. The rest of the guys at poker night that hang out together with him, we don't get what's so exciting about woodworking, but the rest of the people in these podcasts do, and so he finds his niche there. You want to define your niche and speak to that niche. Rule number 4 is your podcast needs to sound professional and polished. If you're a high-value brand, you need to be on level with NPR or better because, again, there's 1 million other podcasts out there. You need to stand above. Early in the history of podcasting, it was okay to sound like you were recorded in a basement, but nowadays you at least have to make the effort. Otherwise, you come across, especially when you're a brand in the podcasting space, you come across as cheap and unprofessional, and those are words that you never want associated with your brand. Finally, this rule is that you have to be patient with a podcast. You don't put an episode out and then log on the next day and see how many people have listened because that's going to depress you a little bit. Podcasting is an investment of time and patience. I recently interviewed for my podcast a fellow by the name of Joe Polizzi. He's referred to as the godfather of content marketing. He even invented the term. And he says that you don't even want to judge the success or failure of your podcast until it's been around for bare minimum 12, preferably 18 months. And that's how much time it takes to properly promote and entice a listenership and build a subscriber base. Remember, you're building fans, not customers, right off the bat.